Cameras have always been expensive for people who want to get into this craft, and they just can't justify spending thousands of dollars on all of the extra things that come with purchasing a camera, like lenses and all of the hidden costs. So for the past 6 months as a side hobby, I've been looking into the used market to see if there's any viable options for those of you who are on a lower budget, but you still want a very high image quality. And I've been pretty shocked to see what's actually out there. It's almost like an art form when you're shopping for a used camera. This full-frame Sony camera came out almost a decade ago, and it's as good as it is now as it was back then when it came out. And I have thoroughly tested this camera out. This is the Sony a7S II. A 12 megapixel full frame E-mount camera. There's a lot of low use secondhand models out there, and it's selling right now for $500 and even less sometimes online. Usually I find it on eBay. I shot both photography and video with this camera so that I could show you the images that I got, and I even left free project files for you to download in the description so that you can download them and edit them as you follow along this video. I'll leave a link to those project files in the description. Also, this video is not sponsored by Sony or by anyone. But if you want to help support the channel and you use the affiliate links in the description to purchase some of your camera gear, then that would be greatly appreciated. The a7S II was released in September of 2015, and it came in right after the launch of the a7R II, which has a 42 megapixel sensor. And also just before the SLT-A68, which is an APS-C camera that I've never heard of. Sony released the a7S II almost a decade ago, and if you go and just browse through the used market, you're gonna see that it's entirely saturated with these guys. Although I never really heard anybody talk about buying a used a7S II, here it is, and it's amazing. Just look at the clarity of these underwater shots where I'm shooting through a piece of 1-inch thick tempered glass. I love these types of shots because it goes to show that no matter what you're doing content creation wise, cameras like this will seriously up your game compared to what you might get if you were shooting with something like a smartphone or a 1-inch sensor camera. The a7S Mark I was released in April of 2014, so almost a year and a half before this guy. Judging by those specs, it's probably a good used camera as well. However, it does not have stabilization, and it only has 25 focus points compared to the 169 focus points that you get with the a7S II. This camera does have 5-axis sensor shift stabilization, meaning that the sensor can physically move in 5 different directions. It can go up and down, left and right, forward and back, and rotate slightly. This movement counteracts any shaking from your camera that you might get from hand holding it, which is super helpful if you're shooting with slower shutter speeds, or if you're in a low light environment, or if you're using a longer lens like a telephoto lens. For all the shots that you're seeing, I didn't even use a tripod except for the headshot, but everything else was handheld, and as you can see, stabilization works okay, but we're gonna talk more about that later in the video. I was shooting in some overcast skies, and you can see even then, it still was able to pull a lot of color out of those shots. The sensor shift stabilization keeps your photos sharp and your videos steady, even without a tripod. Now, one thing to remember is that this is a full frame camera. So when you purchase a full frame camera, you may be inclined to purchase full frame glass as well. And generally speaking, full frame lenses can sometimes be more expensive than the camera body itself. But you could always go into the used market for full frame lenses as well. Like I picked up the full frame 35mm f1.4. It's a Sony Zeiss lens that I'm using for this headshot right now in the used market, and I've used it almost every single time that I've done a headshot in this studio for the past 2 years. One of the great things about Sony E-mount cameras is the sheer number of lenses that you can choose from. This particular model also has a handy crop mode, which means you can use lenses that were designed for smaller APS-C cameras, which will actually give you more flexibility. This is a really big plus, especially for wildlife shooters, because that extra reach will get you closer to where the action is without having to lug around a heavier or more expensive telephoto full frame lens. Now, I personally only used full frame lenses with this camera so that I could utilize the full area of the sensor to really push this camera to its limits so that I could share my results with you. Throughout this video, I'll show you the shots that I got with the lens labeled next to the shots so that you can see what that looks like in case you want to pick up that bundle. The 3 full frame lenses that I used with the a7S II is the Sony 28 to 70mm f3.5 to 5.6, which is Sony's kit lens for their full frame lineup, or it's at least their old kit lens. It's the ones that they sell as a pair when you buy one of these bodies online. If you bought the a7S II used for around $500 and you bought a brand new 28 to 70mm lens, you're still gonna be under $900, which means you have an extra $100 to go out and pick up a couple extra batteries and a memory card which means you can walk out the door and start shooting with a full frame camera for less than $1,000. Another lens that I used with this body is the one that I'm using right now for this headshot, the Sony Zeiss 35mm f1.4. Like I mentioned, I bought that one used as well. And the reason I used it on this camera is because I wanted to see how good those headshots looked when we accentuated that bokeh when I set my aperture all the way down to f1.4. I also used this 35mm lens with the a7S II as an overhead product shot for people who like to do those top-down shots in sort of a first-person view type of angle. If you were to purchase the a7S II body used only and the 35mm f1.4, you're still going to be about between $900 and $1,000. Now, with all of that being said, if you are planning on purchasing a prime lens to do talking head shots like I'm doing right now, just know that this camera does have a 30-minute video record time limit, unless you use the Open Memories tweak. This tool interfaces with Sony cameras through its USB-C, so that you can bypass the recording limits set by Sony. By the way, an interesting tidbit is that before 2019, the reason why cameras had record limits, because if they could record longer than 30 minutes, then they would be classified as a video camera. And video cameras were subject to a higher import tax over in Europe. So camera manufacturers put that record limit in place in most cameras. Since then, that import tax law has been repealed, and that's why after 2019, all of these cameras that we are seeing released today do not have that 30-minute recording limit. Pretty interesting. Now the question is, will Sony release a firmware update that will remove that recording limit on all of the cameras that they created before 2019? We'll have to ask Sony. And I also used the Tamron 17 to 28mm f2.8 as a wide angle lens that I could use in low light situations and to get some vast landscapes, along with some golden hour shots and some sunrise shots. If you pair up a used Tamron 17 to 28 f2.8 with a used body a7S II, you're sitting right at about $1,000 US, but the image quality will be awesome. If you don't already follow me and you like videos like this one, where we talk about how to make better videos with cameras like this, then make sure to join the Film Alliance by subscribing. The reason you may want to go into the used market rather than going with a brand new camera is because of the obvious reason is that your budget will thank you immensely. I'm shooting this headshot right now with the Sony a7S III with that 35mm f1.4 that I talked about, and two very expensive SD cards, which puts this headshot at over $5,000, whereas I could easily come up with a very similar looking headshot, maybe not better, but very similar with the a7S II paired with the same lens. That means for $4,000 less, I could get a very similar looking headshot. Now the a7S III is a more feature-rich camera, which makes it justifiable for me to purchase, because it is able to shoot in 10-bit, it has 2 card slots, and its fully articulating display is extremely helpful for me rather than having to shoot blindly if I was trying to shoot with this camera. Now you could always get an external monitor, which I highly recommend you do, because the display on this camera is not very bright, and it does have a micro HDMI port that you could hook up to an external monitor, which will give you not only better viewing experience, but also a brighter display. And like I mentioned, the a7S III is 10-bit, whereas this camera is only 8-bit. But don't let that scare you. I shot with an 8-bit camera, the a7 III, for many years as my main A-cam before I was even able to pick up an a7S III, and no one ever said to me during those years, man, I really wish your shots looked better, your image quality was better, and I wish you had more dynamic range. As long as I was properly exposing and using the light to my advantage, then I was 100% set. But one of the things that I noticed between the Sony a7S II and the Sony a7S III is there is a different look to them. Just like with older sensors like the Sony a6400, when I compare it to newer camera sensors like the Sony a6700, there's a subtle difference in the way that the images produce the colors, but it's enough for people to say, I kind of like the look of those old sensors better. A lot of you guys have commented on older videos where I compare older sensor cameras to newer sensor cameras that you like the look of the older sensors better. The older sensors have a more filmic or cinematic type look to them compared to the new sensors, which have a more digital or modern look to them. Also, this camera does have some features that the a7S III does not have, like a toggle between autofocus and manual focus and AEL. The autofocus manual focus toggle refers to being able to switch between autofocus and manual focus, which is extremely helpful, especially with this camera. I'll explain why later in the video. On my a7S III, I had to set up a custom button just to be able to toggle between both modes. And the AEL stands for Auto Exposure Lock, which lets you lock the current exposure setting that you have in the camera to maintain consistent lighting even when you're recomposing shots. For the video shots, I mainly shot in 4K 24 and I used the Cine 2 picture profile. And for my photography, I was shooting in RAW, which allowed me to edit my shots in Lightroom afterwards. If you plan on only shooting photography, then I would recommend picking up something like the Sony a7 III, because this camera has a 24 megapixel sensor, but I do typically find that the used a7 IIIs that are online tend to sell for about $200 to $300 more than the a7S II. And that's probably because it has a higher megapixel count. I was trying to keep ISO on this camera at about 1600, as I found online that that was the native ISO to achieve the best image quality. Now, one of the negatives that I found with this camera compared to something like the a7S III is the autofocus is okay. It's not great. It's not like the autofocus that we've seen with a lot of the other Sony cameras that have been released post 2020. And this rule stuck with every single lens that I used on this camera. It wasn't because of the lens, it was because of the camera. Even when I used the Sony kit lens on this camera, it still took a little bit of time, and it was hard pressed to find what I was trying to focus on, even when I was using center focusing. I was getting a lot of focus pumping, and I found myself many times just switching it over to manual focus and then manually adjusting. Now, this wasn't all that bad for me, because lately I've been really relying on manual focus. It gives me more control, and I don't have to worry about the camera deciding on what should be in focus, whether it's the foreground or something in the background. It just makes it a little bit more easy for me. But another tool that I was using in this camera that made it extremely helpful to use manual focus was focus peaking. You can change the color of your focus peaking and the intensity. I chose red and put it at its highest intensity so I could make sure that the edges of the subject or whatever I was shooting was staying in frame. And focus peaking just highlights the edges to ensure that you are in focus. But even then, I was having to use the EVF, or the electronic viewfinder, especially when I was out in brighter environments, because the display does not give you enough clarity and it's not very bright, so it was difficult to see or make sure that my subject was in focus. And that's why I say, if you plan on purchasing this camera and you want to do any type of video work, then budget for an external monitor. That way you can also monitor your image, make sure everything's in focus and everything's exposed correctly. This display does not flip out and articulate like we've seen with other Sony cameras. It only tilts up and down, which means you won't be able to get into those precarious situations that you might be with other Sony cameras. Although I talked about how this camera has 5-axis sensor shift stabilization, that's great for photography, but not so much for video. If you plan on hand-holding and walking with your camera, it's gonna be pretty shaky. Even when I'm hand-holding the camera and I'm standing completely still, you can see that even with this shot of this cool bird, the silhouette of the bird on the dock, there's still quite a bit of movement and shake within the camera itself, which is probably a good thing if you want to have that artistic handheld look, but it's not a good thing if you want to get a nice steady shot, something that a smartphone would give to you, or an action camera. The real benefit to using steady shot with this camera is when you're doing photography, because when you're hand holding your camera, it's gonna minimize the amount of shake that you get around the edges of certain things. I was able to get a lot of these shots that you're seeing right now going completely handheld with a decent shutter speed, 1/50. And then I would raise the shutter speed to get some of those shots of the dog running so it could freeze motion in time, because I was really trying to get that freeze frame motion look rather than any type of motion blur. The bigger body of this camera also is great because it does not overheat at all, just like my Sony a7S III. It has a mic port, a headphone jack, USB-A multi-port for transferring data, and trickle charge. I did find that the record button on the side was a little bit difficult to press. Sometimes I had to reorient my hand and how I was holding this camera in order for me to press it. I'm also used to that record button being on top with all of my other Sony cameras, so that's a little bit difficult. But I was shocked at the image quality that I was getting out of this camera. And the fact that it's only $500 on eBay, I wish this was available when I first started out. Also, this camera uses an NP-FW50 battery, so they're not gonna last as long as some of the batteries that we've gotten with more modern day type of full frame Sony cameras. But these batteries will last, I'd say maybe about an hour while you're out filming or taking photography. Depending on what you're doing, it's gonna last longer. But they're cheap, so you could buy a ton of these and just keep them in your camera bag. Now, there are a ton of other cameras out there that have more features in them, like 4K 60, better stabilization, but you can't beat the price. And if you wanna get into this craft, either as a hobbyist or someone who wants to make a little bit of side money, then this would be the way that I would go. It put out a great image quality, it was fun to use, and you could walk out of the door and start filming with this camera for just under $1,000. I mean, it doesn't get better than that. And you could technically get even more budget-friendly lenses and even walk out the door with under 800 bucks, under 700 bucks, just depending on how much of a budget you're on. So if you're in the market to buy a camera, don't forget to look in the used market and see if there's a camera out there that will meet your needs for what you're doing, whether that's video or photography. I'm Joe with the Film Alliance. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video. One of the most asked questions that I receive is, which camera should I buy? I know that you want to make the right decision, and it's a big decision. You want to find the camera that best suits your needs and stays within your budget. Many of you know which camera might be for you, but you need some guidance pinpointing it and feeling confident in your decision. That's why I made this course. I want to put my camera experience and knowledge into a compact and easy to follow format. I jam-packed it with camera buying fundamentals that I guarantee you will carry through the rest of your camera journey. I base this entire course on all the things that I wish I had known or someone had told me when I first started out. From understanding different camera types and their features to matching them with your specific video and photography needs, this course covers it all. After finishing, I'm confident that you'll finally have clarity over every angle and aspect that you might consider when buying a camera. I'll guide you through my entire camera buying process, taking you 90% of the way there. That way you'll be well prepared to make your decision. This is essentially all the guidance that I would give my own brother if he asked me, "Hey Joe, which camera should I buy?" Now I'm going to share that insight with you.